Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks Show. We have a full roster tonight. Whole bullpen is coming out. So I am Andres Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. We also have Arturo Galletti on Twitter as Arturo Galletti, and the original NBA geek himself, Patrick Minton, aka NBA Geek on Twitter. And as always, we have our producer Brian Foster, aka the Voice of God. You can find him on Twitter at Boxscore. Completely flubbed that. At Boxscore Brian. And Brian, just say hey in case we have you chime in at all during the podcast.
Oh, there's going to be a lot to say on this one for you guys, so I may have to sit this one out.
Sounds good.
We're gonna be really careful about like not getting anybody fired or in trouble, right, Gray?
No one gets fired.
Luckily, I'm the CEO, so you can't fire me.
All right. So anyway, basically I'm not a fan of the off season of going into these subjects, but unfortunately it's just the harsh reality of sports is that there are a lot of these uncomfortable things that happen, and I would feel socially responsible not to at least comment somewhat on them. So we had two pieces on the site this week. Patrick, I'm going to actually just let you get your word in. Arturo, if you and I want to give one response, that's fine, and then move on. And that's kind of with your wishes, Patrick, because as you pointed out,
Sure.
This has gone through the ringer a lot in the media. But you brought up the Ray Rice scenario, and the point that I want to give you that you did a really good job of is you basically said there's a lot of judgment coming in against Ray Rice's fiance, now wife, as to why you would stay. And you said if you look at the research on domestic abuse, it's not as cut and dry as simple as people are making it, and you wanted to get that out there. And so I really like that, and I figure whatever you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the article I linked to later, I updated the article and I linked to an article on Vox.com that was actually written by a woman who's been in shelters and counseling for 5 or 10 years, and even she had an experience with a guy who was verbally abusive. And usually, when we say verbally abusive, we're not talking about a guy telling his wife to shut up or something, but we're talking about real, in your face, screaming at you for hours on end type of abuse. Even she got into a situation like that where she was screamed at for 10 hours, and even she didn't leave. It actually had to happen twice for her to leave. And this is a woman who knew all of the signs, who knew all of the things about codependence, and it was very hard for her to make that decision, and even she struggled with guilt for months on end. So I think the thing that bugs me is we have a couple of fallacies at work here. Actually way back during the Stephen A. Smith discussion, I foolishly got into an argument on Twitter with a follower who actually thought that what Stephen A. Smith was saying was quote unquote just common sense. He was saying all Stephen A. Smith is saying is that if someone's dangerous, you don't provoke them and get in their face. And I thought, well, there's just a world of ridiculousness in that. The first point of ridiculous, though, is the completely absurd notion that for some reason it's easy to identify who is or who is not an abuser. I mean, the world is quite literally full of millions of people who up until 6 months ago thought Ray Rice was a perfectly ordinary, decent guy. Just millions of people who are completely fooled about him. And guys domestic abuse doesn't just happen on the first date. It's not like guys have a sign written across their forehead where it says, "I'm really dangerous, don't provoke me." So there's that. And then there's also, the whole idea of provocation in general, the whole concept of, okay, we know this guy's dangerous, so don't provoke him. It's like, don't you think women that have been beaten before have already tried that tack? Don't you think it's entirely possible that domestic abuse happens all the time and it's completely unprovoked? If you look at the history of domestic violence, it's just full of men who do things like deliberately punching their women, in the stomach or in places where bruises don't show. These are not the behaviors of irrational madmen who just got provoked by craziness. These are the acts of men who are willfully and deliberately doing planned violence. The idea that it could ever be a result of provocation is just completely absurd. And so I think that at the time of the Stephen A. Smith fiasco, he did real damage to educational movements, to women's shelters. He did real damage to those things by sort of propagating that myth of propagation amongst people like this follower on Twitter who didn't really know about the issue, who weren't really thinking things through all the way to the conclusion. And they were thinking, well, Stephen A. Smith is just saying common sense. But the problem is he's not. It's not common sense. It's actually totally unproductive to actually helping women in trouble. And that was the real danger of it. I don't think Stephen A. Smith is, someone who tolerates abuse. I don't think he's a horrible human being. I just think he's completely uninformed, and what he said did real serious damage to any type of movement that is about educating people around domestic violence. And I wanted to write that at the time, and I should have written that at the time. And the recent, release of the second video brought it all forward again. So I thought I'd release it now. And actually, what continues to bother me also about the second video is that it's very much like the Sterling fiasco. We all knew Donald Sterling was a racist 10, 20 years ago. We didn't actually need to hear him say that on tape, but for some reason, the fact that we did prompted everybody to action. And it's the same with Ray Rice. It still boggles my mind that people looked at a video where he's dragging around his unconscious wife, and just because you don't know exactly what happened in the elevator, how could that possibly leave room for you to say, well, we don't know what happened?
And to
right?
clarify on that, because I did some digging, because there was a commenter who, when we were talking, just kind of naivete, I had to delete some comments, just kind of Stephen A. Smith levels. I'm sorry. But, so I did my due diligence, and I actually, we have this wonderful thing called the internet that caches everything. So you're able to go back in time and see what was available at the time. And the police basically released a statement that said they had video of him, hitting her unconscious in the elevator. This happened less than a week after the incident.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the police report's
AP
actually even more interesting.
But the AP is reporting that the NFL was provided with a video in April.
Yeah, well,
but
this is all separate. I'm really talking about fans' reactions. I'm talking about
I think
fans who said we don't know what happened. It's like you see that she went into the elevator conscious and she left unconscious.
I think
go through all of the million scenarios in your head.
I
How
think-
can any of them possibly be good for Ray Rice? How can any of them possibly be justifiable?
I want to address the commenter. I want to address Stephen A. And here's the thing. Here's the problem. Like, fear is psychological abuse. So if the implication is that because you're afraid, if you're afraid of your partner and you're afraid of the fact that he could be physically abusive and he's threatening to you, that's abuse, right? So, and if you're afraid and that's why you don't provoke him and you don't go after him, and I don't want to get into or name names or that, but I'm familiar with situations in which the person is afraid of their partner, and that is just as damaging as the physical abuse. So
well,
the implication
I'm going to go
that,
out on a limb. I'm going to go out on a limb and say Stephen A. Smith wasn't saying, if you're with a wife beater, spouse beater, whatever, just don't provoke him. I don't think that's what he meant. I think what he meant was, if I was I think what he was trying to suggest is that, I would tell my daughters not to get involved with violent men and not to provoke them in the first place and not to date them. And that's the ridiculousness. Ray Rice doesn't walk into a first date and say, hey, by the way, I beat people. You still want to go out with me?
I think there's another point, which is on the whole thing, which is where I think the NFL was frightened spitless. And I've made this point on Twitter. I'm going to make it again, which is, a couple years back, Ray Rice was the poster boy for that Ravens organization. Everybody in the organization loved him. Everybody in the organization kind of still loves him. And I think you can go back and look, very positive pieces. Everybody considers him a leader in that team and whatnot. And if anybody who hasn't seen it should, which is League of Denial, which is the PBS Frontline documentary on concussions and the NFL. And when they talk about what happens to the guys who suffer from CTE, which is what happens with the guy who takes the hits and they suffer early onset dementia, they talk about how the personality of the player changes. They talk about how he gets violent, how he's a different person, and everything about this story.
Actually, and by the way, I'm going to let you know, because this is a much bigger topic. And pre-show, we even said, well, we care and can definitely go other podcasts.
Yeah,
and we're not going down. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to wrap up, Arturo. 30 seconds on the clock, and then we're going to the next subject.
I'm basically going to say, look, everything about this kind of leads me to think that the problem is that, and I made this point, which is there is the possibility of liability on the NFL's part because the NFL might be responsible for what's happening to Ray Rice. And there's every indication to me, it kind of seems like a textbook case of a guy who, because of his work, right, is suffering from trauma, which is harming him and harming his family. And I think the other point which is made, which is like, as bad as this is for Ray Rice, I don't know that it's necessarily right to cost him his livelihood for the rest of his life. Now he has to be contrite, he has to do some sort of reformation, but I don't know that this is enough to cost him the possibility of earning a paycheck for the rest of his career.
And I
think
think it is a valid point to point out that if she gets half of what he earns, the NFL is effectively punishing her too, financially,
Yes.
right? I mean, because if he was still an NFL player, she might have the option of divorcing and walking away, and keeping half of his money, right? I mean, and I'm not advocating that. I'm not saying that this should be obvious to her. I'm simply saying that what the NFL doing isn't actually solving her problem, which is that she has an abusive husband, any more than it would solve the problem when we all hear the stories of somebody that's abusive to their wife and you walk to his house with a garbage can and a baseball bat and you quote unquote take care of things. Well, all that really happens is that 2 days later he takes it out on her. So the NFL isn't really actually solving the domestic abuse problem at all by letting him go. Now, I'm not saying that the NFL should do nothing, nor am I saying that the NFL was wrong to suspend him for life. All I'm saying is that it clearly doesn't solve her problem, right? It doesn't actually make her life better in and of itself.
There is a great cartoon.
I'm gonna say that's a good place to end. I'm stopping. We're going to the next topic because I'm letting you know. I'm gonna apologize. I'm gonna take my coach shoes and say so. Keeping, and I'm going to keep this one really short. I'm going to give us 4 minutes for this. Any more, and I'm just going to shut us off. And this is my topic too. Basically, the Atlanta Hawks are a hot mess of, and this is nothing surprising for Atlanta, as you were saying, Arturo. Basically, just kind of a hot mess of racist undertones, poor management. Levinson basically had an email, and I just want to give my point on this subject first. I'll let you both chime in and then we move on. Basically, the reason I had a problem with the email is he has this really long email where he says he's had an epiphany as to why the Hawks aren't selling more tickets. And the epiphany is the black fans and the black culture. So things like black cheerleaders, black people showing up on the Kiss Cam, hip hop shows after the games are scaring away white people. Now, again, there might be a point to that because of the area. But the reason I was offended by this is that if you look at the very simple data of what attracts fans to your product, it's a winning team. And the other possible thing you can have is if you happen to have good teams that you play again, like people will watch LeBron if LeBron comes to town regularly. But the problem with the Hawks is that they had a crappy team. Even though they've been making the playoffs, it's making the playoffs in the East. Their team has progressively been getting worse. The opponents that they're playing are pretty bad because they're in a bad conference and a bad division. And that really explains why they're not selling tickets. And so for this guy to come out and his first theory is the reason we're not selling well is black people, instead of going, the reason we're not selling well is we're not winning games, to me was so ludicrous that people were calling that. There were a few people. The one person I got upset with, as Patrick pointed out, we're never going to win this argument, but I'll at least sort out. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has a post out where he calls Levinson a rational businessman. And I said, how on earth can you call that being your first conclusion to jump through and having basically an opus on all of the black things about your games that are causing the problem and ignoring just, hey, we don't have a good team, be considered rational? That was my take on it. That's what I wanted to get out there. It depresses me a little that, it's being discussed if it's racist or not. We can discuss the implications of that. But the fact that I've seen multiple lines say, now I don't think Levinson is racist, to start articles just depressing me. And Patrick, I think a point you said gets even worse is when we look at the fairy nonsense of him either reading or saying racist comments about, say, Luol Deng, and it's why Luol Deng didn't want to go to the Hawks. You can't really clean it. He can't really clean his hands and say, no, I think things are good, because that organization has had tons of problems.
To me, the whole thing about Danny Ferry is, okay, you say you didn't really say those things. You were just reading off a report that was prepared for you. Then I'm like, okay, well, then I want to fire you because you're fucking stupid. Who goes into a meeting with all of their superiors Like if I'm going in to read a report to my superiors, I damn well read the report that I'm going to read out loud first. And if it
I'm
contains
gonna
garbage like that, I say, where does this garbage come from and who wrote it and how do I fire them? It does not
let
make
me
Danny Ferry sound better to say, oh, I read it off a report that was prepared for me. That's
yeah
ridiculous.
I'm gonna wade into some a little bit of dangerous waters, which is look, I'm gonna make this a following point, which is I've lived in the South. I've lived in multiple places. I lived in Atlanta, and I've worked in multiple places around the world. And honestly, and Atlanta is one of the more racist places I've ever actually been. And I think one of the things, there's a couple things, and again, I disagree with the context. I agree with the point that Dre is making. I think a couple points which are important is one, it's the context. So it's probably not the first idea that he's thrown out, and there is such a thing, and I'm not going to get into it as the concept of white flight in Atlanta, which is there is kind of a friction where like the white citizens of Atlanta don't want to be in the same place as black citizens, particularly for events, and this is a thing that happens in Atlanta. I think winning actually draws that, but this is something that actually happens there. I think the other thing which is really important, which is there's such a thing as a corporate culture, and there's such a thing as a local. I'm going to defend. I'm not defend. I'm not. I don't want to defend this, but I'm going to kind of explain a little bit what happens, which is when you're in a culture that is where racist comments or racist thoughts, or it's a little more old school and deep South. Some of these comments are not. So it's a little bit of like a locker room culture. They're not. They're. It's a little more permissive to this kind of comment. So I'm not saying I would. I'm saying that probably in the context of the room that he was in, right? This was not a shocking comment. Particularly, I mean, I think he made the
That's
comment and
not true at
clarified
all,
it.
though. The very people that were in that room were the people that complained about it.
Well,
Every
somebody
single
could,
listener on that call was horrified to the point that a minority owner decided to contact the majority owner and ask for him to be fired.
I
That's
think
that's that's clearly what he said was not acceptable to that room.
I'm
And
saying
and by the way, even if it were, that wouldn't make this any better.
I'm not saying I'm just kind of placing a context around the situation. Again, I'm not saying that I think he's racist. I think he made a dumb comment at a dumb moment in the wrong crowd, and he should never put himself in the position to do that. And I'll say this: look, I've worked in Mexico, right, and I've worked in like Eastern Europe, and there are certain things that happen in those cultures, and certain comments that happen and I've worked in Latin America as well. There are certain, for example, sexist comments that happen in those rooms that people make in those rooms, and really, it could be like a huge higher up in a certain company that makes that comment.
So,
And
so I'm going to say candidly, Arturo, I have no idea where you're going, and you have, again, I'm going to put you on the clock again. You got 30 seconds to wrap up the topic, then we're going to talk fun
I would
stuff.
say, so look, like people will make these like super sexist comments in those cultures, and you basically have no recourse to say anything to them. But you shouldn't put yourself in a situation where you do it, right? So I think that's kind of, so what I'm suggesting is there's a possibility that somebody in Ferry's organization, in that group, is making these racist comments, and in that room it becomes acceptable. And I think that's kind of, or like it looks acceptable, but he shouldn't put himself in a position where he's actually making the dumb racist comment, right? So that's
all I have to say for this is there's two possibilities. One is that Danny Ferry's a racist, and I've actually heard lots of reports that he probably isn't from people that know him. And two is that he's a moron because he read a report to his superiors in a briefing where the entire point of the briefing was to inform his superiors about what he is doing in his job. And he read a report that he didn't read in advance of the meeting. Like either one of those, in my opinion, is a firing offense. Because anybody that goes that ill prepared into a meeting with their superiors does not deserve to keep their job.
Yeah,
I mean, at the very least, if that happened to me, I would go in the meeting and say, "I'm sorry, guys, I'm not prepared for this meeting. I can't do it." And then everyone would yell at me and talk about a poor job I've done. But that's much better than reading a report that I literally didn't read in advance, and who knows what the hell's in there to my superiors, because that is a firing offense.
I'll agree with that. And I mean, just, yeah, we can see all sorts of problems in Atlanta. And the sad part, to your point, I think you said you were kind of less interested in arguing if Levinson was a racist or not. I don't think it's a question, unfortunately. I'm sorry, people on Twitter, I still get offended by those comments at the top of articles. But the bigger point is just Atlanta's a mess and how things are being run there. And that is a question. And I think that showed a lot of it. All right. Actually, this is fun. So the last topic we've got is actually enjoyable. I think we all actually want to discuss this. This got us all really excited, and I'll be, like I said, the Ray Rice and Levinson stuff kind of got me depressed in the week because I kind of didn't want to talk about it, but I kind of felt, socially irresponsible not, especially given that it's in our sphere. But the Ari Caroline scale, basically Ari, looking at, say, something like Netflix, which has the 1 to 5 scale, has a much better process for off-season rankings. So the off-season rankings we used to do was we try and estimate how many wins a team was going to have in the next season, which is fun. We might still make bets on stuff like that this year. But Ari's point was, what if you just looked at a team and you gave it a 1 to 5 ranking? 1 being the team just, crap the bed, is going to be much worse next season. 2 being they got worse. 3 being stayed the course. Everything's fine. 4 being they got better. 5 being they're the Cleveland Cavaliers. And just kind of going, do you want to go through the entire NBA, rank each team this way? And then your point, I think you and him, I forget who said it first, Patrick, you or Ari, but basically making sure it's zero sum, right? We can't have all the teams getting better, all the teams getting worse. I'm thinking we might actually ask our listeners to chime in on it and basically give them a plus or minus 3 stars that they can go in their ratings. Basically, they can assume the league's gotten a little worse or the league's gotten a little better, but not a lot. But this is fantastic. You took the first crack at it with the Timberwolves. I'm excited both about this scale and just kind of looking at some teams. And the T-Wolves, this was enjoyable to see, is that you didn't, they let Love walk out the door and somehow you didn't give him a 1.
Okay, so if the rating was 1 to 5 based on how stupid I think you are, I would have given them a 1, but that's not the rating. The rating is how much worse are they going to be than next year. And the reality is that they have a couple of decent players left on the roster, and the other reality is that they did happen to trade away the by far worst player on their roster, and in fact, as I wrote, the worst point guard in the NBA. So the mere fact of that guy's absence is gonna. So let's just to pull a number completely out of my ass. Let's say that losing Kevin Love costs the team 12 wins. They win 12 fewer games because now Kevin Love's not there. But I would say, okay, shipping away Jose Pereira, that wins you 2 games. So now we're only at -10. And then I said,
Hey!
but okay, now I'm sorry he's your countryman, but he's the worst point guard in the NBA.
Hey!
Or then I say, okay, but now Georgie Deng, who looks really good, suddenly he gets more minutes because there's more minutes for him to play, but he's really, really good. So, okay, that wins you back 2 to 3 games from those 12. And then you say, well, okay, Corey Brewer's not going to play as much, and he's pretty terrible. So, maybe Chase Buttinger will see some minutes, and that wins you 1 or 2 games. All I'm saying is that rather than being a straight up -12 next year, they're going to be a minus, 8 or 9. And so they didn't get as worse, relatively speaking, as, for example, Indiana is going to get, because Indiana is going to be a complete train wreck compared to last year. I think if we look at the delta between, Indiana in 13-14 and Indiana in 14-15, it's going to be a much bigger number than the delta for the Timberwolves. And let's also remember that the Timberwolves were already kind of mediocre / bad, so they didn't have that much room to get worse, right? Yeah, so that's why they got a 2 instead of a 1 for me.
Yeah, I think we've been playing also with the numbers a little bit, and one thing that's really interesting is it looks like the unit of measure is for an 82-win season, it's about 10% of it. It's about 8.2 wins. So when we say, so generally what we're saying is like you look at the history of the league over the last 20, 25 years, we typically see teams like they'll get like, if they get like in the range of a normal distribution, they'll get 8, 16, or like 8 games worse or 16 games worse. And then we have the cases where like things fall off the cliff. And I think the T-Wolves are an interesting case because they match a lot of the characteristics of a team kind of that drops off the cliff. But I kind of like the roster they've put together. I'm with you. I like the roster. It's a young roster. I don't know that they're going to try as hard, but they do have kind of talent at every position. And I like Deng, and I like a lot of the rookies that they actually picked up. So it's actually like I keep thinking that they should move Pekovic and kind of get a couple more assets, and maybe like I'd rather have them win 30 games this year.
So Arturo, question on that: where do you want Pekovic to go? Like, because obviously he's a talented player. Who do you think he could help out this next season?
Yeah, I think if they could move him for like another wing player, like a 2-3 guy. I think that would be interesting.
Well, but that's the one thing they won't do now, because now they've drafted and traded for about 15 wings, right? Yeah, that's the one position that they won't trade for.
If they can package Kevin Martin and Pekovic into something, Or I mean, like even if it's just an expiring contract, I mean, I want him off the books and be more a little bit more like Sixers or like the Thunder work where like I have all these great young guys, get a couple more assets in, and as I said, you mentioned it. Ding has looked great in FIBA and he's looked great last season. I think Wiggins, he's not good now. He wasn't good for the Cavs who need to win now, but he'll be
Well, yeah.
good.
I mean, the really bitter thing about this is that Deng was the perfect complement to Kevin Love. So what
Yeah.
they should have done, I still maintain this to this day, what they should have done is traded Peck to get all the minutes for Deng there, traded Peck for like competent wing player and or backup point guard, maybe an asset or something. Nothing too spectacular. My dream scenario was like, get Ryan Anderson to come off the bench or something like that.
Apparently,
And then you play Love and Deng a lot. You play, a good if you get a decent small forward from the Peck deal, you got a 55 win team easily. And then you play that way for a year with Kevin Love, and then you say, are you sure you want to walk away from a 55 win team?
I don't think it was an option. I think at that point, I think at this point, I think the script is written. I think Kevin Love was going to play with LeBron, and
I think that Kevin Love believes that, but
I think Eric Bledsoe is next. I think Eric Bledsoe will play on the Cavs as well. I think that's going to happen too. I think this is more of a backroom kind of things that's going to happen, independent of what anybody else says. I think once they decided that, I think the way to go is what they're doing, and I think the next thing they need to do is, as I said, move. If they move Peck and Day,
but let's be honest, the only reason that happened is because Flip loves Andrew Wiggins. The only reason that happens is that Flip loved the idea of having Andrew Wiggins. So when Love was like, hey, I want to go to Cleveland, Flip was like, I guess I could do that. I do really like Andrew Wiggins. I mean, if Flip was the kind of guy who had a mentality like me that said, no, I'm not going to trade you for anything. I'm just going to make you play for me. That's what would have happened. And I know Kevin Love wants to leave desperately. And I'm sure Kevin Love himself is thinking, wow, if I'd have played, I'd have been instantly gone next year, no matter what. But the reality is that can change. If he'd had a year of having a blast and winning 55 games, he might have thought totally different next year. He might have really thought, wow, do I really want to walk away from a 55 win team and a max contract? Right? I mean, you have to make him make that choice. That's the only rational play. And the deal they got for Kevin Love, it may have been the best deal on the table, and it might be something that all the other executives in the league think was a good deal for him, but it was a terrible fucking deal. You got a guy who might be a bust. You got a guy who is a bust. You got an underperforming big who can walk away at the end of next year for the best power forward in the NBA. That is a horrible fucking deal. There's no way you can sugarcoat that.
I think I rate Anthony Bennett higher than a lot of people. I think Bennett can be good.
Yeah, so if you're rating him higher than everybody else, then he's a bad player instead of a terrible player. That doesn't make the deal any good.
Well, no, I think again. How do I put this? I think they got worse. I don't think they got. This is not LeBron walking away from the Cavs, which is like, and that's like if you look at the last 30 years, that's the biggest collapse. It's 42 games. I don't think it's that.
Yeah, and the Cavs at that time had no young players that were stepping in.
Well, I mean, that scenario had Varejao get injured and a lot of other stuff. We're coming up close on time, and if you've been paying attention on your Boxscore Geeks drinking game, I don't know how many shots you just took there with our Kevin Love discussion, but I have one last question. So the obvious answer is Cleveland is obviously a 5, just no doubt. And in fact, they may break the scale for what a 5 is. Last question, you guys.
Cleveland's like 6.5.
Yeah. Last question, you guys, before we go to our next question. Who are your 5s or maybe top 4s? Like for you guys, Ari has sent us a cheat sheet, and I know Arturo, you've already got your spreadsheet ready. So I figure that's a fun, tantalizing thing to end our users with. I'm going to say I haven't actually done my homework yet, so I haven't made my spreadsheet, but don't worry, that'll be coming out in the near future from everybody.
So the question is, who got way better? So we got the Cavs. We know the Cavs got way better. I think the Clippers got better. And the only reason I'm not giving them the top grade is they were already a really good team. I think they went from crap bench to kind of a really decent bench. And if they can get more minutes from Chris Paul this year, then Blake and DeAndre can continue to improve. I think that team is really good. I think the Spurs stay where they were. I think, let's see, I'm trying to think I think the Wiz got a little better. I'm trying to think who else got way better. We already said the Cavs. I mean, What do you got, Patrick?
I only got 1-5, and that's the Cavs. And like I said, the Cavs
Any
the
high
Cavs could be.
force?
I got some mid fours, but let me talk for a second. One of the problems with the Cavs is they're sucking up all the good players that want to play with LeBron, which had less room for other teams to get better, right? I mean, they're getting players like Sean Marion and stuff that could have made other teams a little better. So I think the Cavs are my only 5. I think some strong 4s I got. I think actually that one of my stealth 4s is the Charlotte Bobcats. I think the Charlotte Bobcats are a 4.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, part of it is because obviously the Bobcats had room to get better.
You know who I might give a 5 to if they find a way to.
I have no idea. Arturo is like
basically
really
have one of
breaking
their
up for
shooting
me.
guards disappear. They're at 4. I might give them a 5.
We didn't hear anything you just said, Arturo.
If the Pelicans can find a way to get Austin Rivers to disappear, I would give them a 5.
All right.
Yep. Yeah. I think that. Yeah.
And I was going to say, Patrick, you said you had a hard stop now. So if you've actually got to hop off, that's fine.
I'm just going to say one more 4 I have, and I think it's again a stealth 4. It's Chicago, and I think I think that Pau Gasol is a little bit of it, but not really the big. I think the big piece is going to be getting the real Derrick Rose back. That's going to make a big difference. But I've done this twice before.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I've now drafted Derrick Rose in my fantasy team like 3 fucking years, and every year he's like, "Oh no, I'm gonna break an ankle or something." So,
yeah,
but still, I'm gonna go with it. I'm gonna give Chicago a 4.
I don't know that Derrick Rose exists anymore.
Yeah, and I just feel like he gets to use whole of the Team USA tournament to work out all the kinks and get all the shittiness out of his game. I feel like because of that, he's gonna be able to at least by October, November, December, be in a close to Derrick Rose form. And let's be honest, that's all they really need is if they get 60% of the old Derrick Rose, that's all they need, because their point guard position was just awful, right? And they were a good team in spite of it.
You know who my stealth 5 is? I know who my stealth 5 is. It's the Denver Nuggets.
No. I'm not taking it. You've given me this argument.
You get to be a Bucks fan now. You get to be a Bucks fan now. Oh,
God. All right.
No, they put the band back together. Not only that, but Kenneth Faried is the best player on Team USA. It's great.
We haven't talked about that, because we didn't go last week.
I think it's going to be a similar thing to what happened with Kevin Love 4 years ago. Was it 4 years ago? I think it was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Where, Kurt Rambis thought Kevin Love was like, oh, he's, the 4th best player on a contending team. Then all of a sudden he dominates in Team USA, and he's like, I guess I should give this guy a few minutes. Right. And then eventually what happens is what happened to Kurt Rambis. He still wasn't giving Love 10 minutes. So Love's like, well, fuck you. I'm going to go out and get 30 rebounds and get on SportsCenter. And then I'm going to fucking dare you not to play me 30 minutes. And suddenly it happened. And I think that could happen with Faried. Faried could go for 30 rebounds, and then Brian Shaw's like, well, I'm fucked now. I got to give him 30 minutes every night, no matter what, right? Yeah, that could easily happen.
All right, Arturo, you're breaking off. I'm gonna hit us.
Numbers when we talked about
I'm gonna let you know that monologuing Arturo is rough, because you're seriously echoing and slowing, you sound like kind of like a ghost that's talking slow. So I'm gonna get us to shout outs and get us out. So Patrick, if you've got anybody you want to shout out, I'll let you go first, because I got a couple. And like I said, even if after that, if you need absolutely just drop off, that's cool too.
Mine's the easy one. I'm going to shout out to Ari Caroline for a fantastic Caroline scale, for provoking us into one of the more animated discussions we've had on our list the last week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks, month maybe. So follow him at Ari Caroline, all one word, no underscores, no hyphens, nothing. Great follow, really smart guy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that was one on my list. Then I was going to say, Brian, you had one. Do you want to shout that out?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Whenever there's, racial topics going around, Bomani Jones is a great read, and he had a pretty funny tweet today. For some reason, I always go to the jokes when it's a serious topic. I'm a bad person, Dre, but anyway, I'm putting that up on screen right now, and that was pretty funny. But I'll actually say something somewhat serious about this. TMZ has been uncovering a few things lately, and it's been kind of disruptive.
That it's weird that TMZ is more. Yeah, we do that. All right, so I got 3. The first one's actually from a few weeks back, but fit our topic this week. It's Christopher Baxter again, because we always just nominate the same people over and over again. So it's at Cbax on Twitter, and he at his webcomic cbax.net. He's got one called Draft Despair, which just kind of perfectly sums up kind of what we were talking about, Patrick, about if you're going to be a fantasy sports owner, what kind of horrible racial or social thing are you going to inadvertently support by drafting that team? And so it's a hilarious comic in that it's just so spot on. It's like the Onion. The other two I've got are Anita Sarkeesian, aka at FemFreak, Feminist Frequency, who recently released her, I think, Tropes as Women video, which is women as background decoration, which is just, it's a depressing thing if you're a video game fan, but, you know, she's a high scale feminist that does a lot of these videos on gaming, always gets a lot of pushback when she does it, but she keeps doing them. So shout out to that. And then on the same line, Zoe Quinn, who's at The Conspiracy. If you've been following Gamergate, made me hate Adam Baldwin, unfortunately, which was basically this 4chan just attack on a person. And she went undercover, got chat logs, and, you know, it makes you depressed about video games and misogyny, but, you know, happy to see a few heroes. So those are my shout outs.
I've got one for a Toronto Raptors fan, Julian Roger. He is ASFW_J Roger. And I'm shouting out to him because he jumped in a discussion between myself, Snooty Drippin, and Ethan Strauss about who was better, Steph Curry or Russell Westbrook. And we're obviously on Team Curry. It was actually kind of a fun discussion. We were arguing who the second best point guard in the league was. And a very interesting discussion. I think the other one is it's going to be a shout out.
Chris Paul.
Second best, yes. Chris Paul's number
but
one.
I mean, but I'm sorry, I don't think either Curry or Westbrook is the second best. I think Lowry's the second best.
Ooh.
Lowry's. I've got Lowry at 4, but we can. This is a whole other topic.
And then let's leave it. Okay, yeah, I don't want to open up a new discussion, but Team Rondo also.
Well, Rondo hasn't been healthy, so I think last year. I think the other shout out
what am I saying? Team Rubio is where it's at.
Team Rubio, there you go. Because a steal is worth 9 points.
Yes.
No, I think the other thing I was going to say is that was a underground shout out to Skeptical Sports. I think the other one is a shout out to Chauncey Billups, who just retired, and we were having a fun discussion. Like everybody's like on Twitter, kind of like they're trying to compare him to AI. And, you know, it's not like, you know, Chauncey got traded for AI and you know, one team got demonstrably better and one team got demonstrably worse. No, wait, that actually did happen. So Chauncey Billups is much better than Allen Iverson.
And then, in tacking onto that, Ethan Sherwood Strauss definitely made that point. I saw that Twitter one, which had a bunch of replies. So some great shout outs. Thanks, guys. And we will see you next week.